My name is Olivia. I'm 29 years old, and for the last 3 years, my husband treated me like I was a problem he was forced to solve. I kept telling myself his constant distance was just stress about our future. But the moment that finally made the truth impossible to ignore came 5 minutes after I woke up from surgery. I reached for my phone, the room still spinning, and saw the notification. $58,600, everything we had saved for our first baby, had just been transferred out of our joint account. Beside my hospital bed, resting directly on top of my clothes, was a handwritten note. "I'm done taking care of you, you're a burden." The recovery nurse stopped adjusting my IV, her face dropping as the color drained from mine. I was still hooked up to machines. I couldn't even stand. I had built my whole life around a man who walked away while I was under anesthesia. I thought my life was completely over. I was wrong. Because in his rush to clean out our accounts and abandon me in that hospital, he left his tablet sitting on a chair in the waiting room. He had no idea I was about to open it, read 6 months of messages between him and my own sister, and forward every single screenshot directly to her fiancé. What happened next wasn't just going to end my marriage, it was about to burn my entire family's reputation to the ground. Before I go on, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story speaks to you. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now let me take you back to understand why David felt he could just walk away while I was under anesthesia. You have to understand how my family worked. In our house, there was a very clear hierarchy. My sister, Chloe, was the sun. Everything and everyone else just orbited her, trying to stay warm. I was the one who made sure the bills were paid and the chores were done so the sun could keep shining. 6 months before the surgery, we all met for Sunday lunch at my parents' house. It was a humid afternoon, and the air conditioner was humming in the corner. Chloe was sitting at the head of the table, showing off her engagement ring to my mother for the 100th time. She was marrying Mark, a guy who treated her like she was made of glass. "The venue in the Hamptons is just so expensive," Chloe sighed, pushing a piece of grilled chicken around her plate. "But Mark says I deserve the best. It's just a lot of pressure, being the perfect bride." My mother reached over and patted her hand. "You've always had a special light, Chloe. People want to celebrate that. It's only natural." I looked over at David. He was sitting next to me, but he felt 1,000 miles away. He hadn't touched his food. Usually, he'd give my hand a squeeze when my mother started gushing over Chloe, a little silent signal that he was on my team. Not that day. He was staring at his reflection in his water glass, his jaw tight. "What about you two?" my father asked, looking at us. "Olivia, you're nearly 30. When are we going to see some grandbabies? Chloe is already planning her life. You two seem stalled." I felt a familiar sting in my chest. I hadn't told them about the mounting physical pain I was in or the tests I'd been running. I didn't want to take the spotlight away from Chloe's engagement month. "We're working on it, Dad," I said, trying to catch David's eye. "We've been saving up. We want to be ready." David didn't say a word. He just stood up, mumbled something about a work call, and walked out to the porch. He didn't come back in until it was time to leave. That was the beginning of the silence. Over the next few months, David moved his things into the guest room. He told me he was stressed about a big project at the firm. He said my constant doctor appointments and my moodiness were making it hard for him to focus. Whenever I tried to talk to him about the surgery I eventually needed, he'd look at his watch. "I'm sure you'll be fine, Olivia," he'd say, his voice flat. "You always make such a big deal out of things. I have a business to run." Meanwhile, Chloe was constantly over at our house. She'd show up unannounced, complaining about wedding flowers or bridesmaids' dresses. She'd sit in the living room with David for hours while I was in the bedroom, resting my back. I could hear them laughing through the vents. It was a sharp, bright sound that felt like a needle under my skin. One evening, I walked into the kitchen to get some water. They were standing by the island. David was holding his tablet, showing her something. They were leaning in close, too close. "It's almost enough," I heard Chloe whisper. "It will be enough," David replied. When they saw me, they didn't jump. They didn't look guilty. They just looked at me like I was an interruption, like I was a guest who had overstayed my welcome in my own home. "Don't you have a heating pad to sit on, Liv?" Chloe asked, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary concern. "You look exhausted. You should go lie down." I looked at David, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for him to tell her to be more respectful. He just tapped his tablet screen and walked away without looking at me. I went back to the bedroom and pulled out my phone. I opened our banking app and stared at the balance. $58,600. That was our starting a life fund. We lived frugally for 5 years to build that. It was my safety net. It was the only thing that made me feel like I had a future, even as my marriage felt like it was crumbling into sand. I remember holding my thumb over the transfer button, wondering if I should move my half to a separate account. But then I felt guilty. I felt like I was being paranoid. David was my husband. We were a team. I put the phone on the nightstand and closed my eyes. The morning of the surgery was gray and cold. David drove me to the hospital, but he didn't turn off the engine when we pulled up to the surgical center. "I have a meeting at 10, he said, staring straight through the windshield. "The nurse said they'll call me when you're out. There's no point in me sitting in a waiting room for 4 hours. "David, I'm scared," I said. My voice was small, even to me. "You're fine," he said. He finally looked at me, but his eyes were like two pieces of flint. "Just go in and get it over with. You're always such a burden with this health stuff." That word, burden. It felt heavier than the physical pain. I got out of the car. I didn't look back. I walked into the hospital alone, clutching my insurance card and my pride. I remember the smell of the antiseptic and the coldness of the linoleum floor. I remember the nurse asking me if I had a support person on site. I told her he was on his way. That was the last lie I told for a long time. As they wheeled me back toward the operating room, I looked at the bright lights on the ceiling. I thought about the $58,600. I thought about the nursery we were supposed to build. I thought about the man I'd married. I realized I wasn't just going under for surgery. I was going under because I couldn't bear to stay awake in a life that felt this empty. I didn't know that while I was asleep, the person I trusted most was busy deleting me from his life. The first thing I felt was the cold. It wasn't just the hospital air conditioning. It was the kind of deep, internal chill that comes from being hollowed out. I remember the rhythmic hiss-click of the monitor and the heavy, metallic taste of the anesthesia still coating my tongue. My vision was blurry, catching the edges of the pale green privacy curtains. I reached for my phone on the rolling bedside table. My fingers felt like lead. I just wanted to see a text from David, something saying he was in the waiting room or that he'd see me soon. Instead, the screen was flooded with alerts from my banking app. Transfer successful. Amount, $58,600.00. Remaining balance, $12.42. I blinked, trying to force my eyes to focus. I thought I was hallucinating. I thought maybe the meds were making me see numbers that weren't there. I refreshed the app. The little blue loading circle spun and then mocked me with the truth. The account we had spent 5 years building, the money I'd skipped vacations and new clothes for, was gone. I looked at the transaction history. It had been moved to a private account in David's name only. He'd done it at 9:15 a.m., exactly 15 minutes after they'd wheeled me into the OR. He didn't even wait to see if I'd wake up. "David," I tried to call out, but my throat was raw from the intubation tube. It came out as a pathetic, dry rasp. I looked to my left, toward the chair where my bag and clothes were sitting. Resting right on top of my folded jeans was a piece of white paper. It was a page torn from a legal pad, the edges jagged. I recognized the handwriting instantly. David always used a heavy hand, the ink bled through slightly. I leaned over, a sharp, searing pain shooting through my abdomen where the incisions were. I grabbed the paper. "I'm done taking care of you. You're a burden, that was it. No, I'm sorry." No explanation about where he was going. Just a finality that felt like a door slamming in a dark room. He had used my surgery as a tactical window. He knew I'd be incapacitated, unable to call the bank, unable to stop him, and too weak to chase after him. A nurse stepped through the curtain, checking a clipboard. She looked up and her entire posture changed. I must have looked like a ghost. "Sweetie, are you okay? Your heart rate is spiking," she said, hurrying to the bedside. I couldn't speak. I just held out the note with one hand and pointed to the phone screen with the other. My hand was shaking so violently the paper rattled. The nurse, whose name tag read Sarah, took the note. She read it once, then twice. She looked at the phone. She didn't say the usual hospital platitudes. She didn't tell me everything would be fine. She just exhaled a long, angry breath and gripped the railing of my bed. "He left this here?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, the tears finally starting to burn. They weren't soft tears, they were hot and stinging. "I have no money," I managed to whisper. "He took the baby fund." Sarah looked toward the door, then back at me. "Is there someone I can call? A mother? A sister?" I thought of Chloe. I thought of the way she looked at David at the kitchen island. I thought of my mother's voice telling me not to ruin Chloe's engagement month. If I called them now, they'd tell me I was overreacting. They'd say David was just stressed and that I shouldn't be dramatic while I was recovering. The weight of it hit me all at once. I was 29 years old, lying in a recovery ward with 3 fresh holes in my stomach, and I had exactly $12 to my name. I didn't have a ride home. I didn't even know if I had a home to go back to. David had the keys. David had the car. David had my life in his pocket. "I need to get up," I said, trying to swing my legs over the side of the bed. "No, no," Sarah said, gently but firmly pushing me back. "You just had major abdominal surgery. You try to walk now, you're going to open those stitches and end up back in the OR. You stay put." "I can't pay for this," I sobbed, the panic finally breaking through the anesthesia fog. "Sarah, he took everything. How am I supposed to pay the hospital? How am I supposed to buy my prescriptions?" She reached out and squeezed my hand. Her gloves were cool and latex smooth, but her grip was solid. "We're going to figure that out," she said. "But right now, you need to breathe. You're not a burden, Olivia. You're a patient and you're under my care. He's the one with the problem, not you." She walked over to the cabinet and grabbed a cup of water with a straw, holding it to my lips. I took a sip, the cold water hitting my throat like a shock. I looked at the note again. Burden. I realized then that this wasn't a snap decision. You don't wait for a surgery and time a bank transfer to the minute because you're stressed. This was a heist. My husband had spent months watching me get sicker, watching me prepare for this day, not so he could support me, but so he could use my vulnerability as his exit ramp. I closed my eyes and saw the image of our joint account again. $12.42. That was the value of my marriage. That was what David thought I was worth. "I'm going to check the waiting room," Sarah said, her eyes narrowing. "Sometimes people leave things in their rush to be cowards." She stepped out, leaving me alone with the silence of the recovery room. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them to keep from screaming. I had lost my husband, my savings, and my dignity before the anesthesia had even worn off. I was at the absolute bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. A few minutes later, Sarah came back in. She wasn't empty-handed. She was holding a black tablet with a cracked screen protector. "He didn't just leave a note," she said, setting the tablet down on my bed. "He left his brain behind. I found this tucked into the cushion of the chair where he was sitting while you were in surgery." I recognized it instantly. It was David's work tablet, the one he never let me touch, the one he'd been using to whisper with Chloe in the kitchen. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the device, then at the burden note still crumpled in my hand. David thought he had taken everything I had. He didn't realize he had just given me the only thing that could actually destroy him. The immediate medical cost was bad, but the social cost was turning out to be much worse. My parents didn't come to the hospital. When I finally got through to my mother that afternoon, the background noise on her end was a chaotic mix of clinking glassware and Chloe's high-pitched laughter. "Olivia, darling, I really can't talk right now," my mother said, her voice strained with that specific kind of patience she reserved for my outbursts. "We're at the florist. Chloe is having a meltdown over the hydrangeas. You know how she gets when she's stressed." "Mom, David left me," I said. I was staring at the IV bag dripping into my arm. "He took the baby fund, all $58,000. He left a note calling me a burden and he's gone." There was a pause. For a second, I thought I heard a gasp. But then I heard the sharp clack of my mother's heels on a tile floor. "I'm sure there's an explanation," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "David has been under so much pressure with your health issues. People do rash things when they're overwhelmed. Just give him some space to breathe. And please don't start a fire today. It's Chloe's big engagement month. If you start calling around making accusations, it's going to ruin everything for her." "He stole my money, Mom." "It's your marriage, Olivia. You two need to work it out privately. Don't drag the rest of us into your drama. I'll call you after the tasting, okay? Stay hydrated." The line went dead. I looked at the phone for a long time. My mother didn't ask which room I was in. She didn't ask if the surgery was successful. She didn't even ask if I had a way to get my prescriptions. To her, a theft and an abandonment were just drama that might smudge the polish on Chloe's perfect life. An hour later, a text came in from Chloe. "Hey sis, Mom said you and David are having a tiff. So sorry to hear that. Men can be so moody, lol. Anyway, I'm totally stressed about the seating chart for the engagement dinner on Friday. Mark is being a literal statue and won't help. Hope you're feeling better. Sending vibes." She followed it with a string of heart emojis. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the painkillers. She knew. Looking back at that text now, I can see the cruelty in the casualness. She was checking to see if I was broken enough to stay quiet. She was benefiting from my silence while I was literally paying for her peace of mind with my health and my stolen savings. The hospital's billing coordinator came by at 4:00 p.m. She was a kind woman in a gray suit, but her job was the bottom line. "Ms. Harris, we're seeing that the primary card on file was declined for the copay and the scheduled post-op care facility," she said, looking down at her tablet. "And the insurance is flagging a change in status. Did you authorize a withdrawal from the secondary account?" "No," I said. My voice was steady now. "My husband took it. He emptied the account." "I see," she said. She looked genuinely sorry. "Without that payment, we can't transition you to the recovery center. We'll have to discharge you to a home address. Is there someone who can stay with you? You can't be alone for the first 48 hours. "I don't have anyone," I said. "What about your sister or your parents?" "They're busy," I said, "with a seating chart." The coordinator bit her lip. "Olivia, if you don't have a safe place to go and you can't pay the facility fee, we have to involve social services for a temporary placement. It's a lot of paperwork and it's not. It's not where you want to be while you're healing." This was the wider harm. David hadn't just taken the money, he had stripped away my ability to heal in peace. He had turned me into a ward of the state while he was likely sitting in a nice hotel or a new apartment, fueled by my hard-earned cash. Nurse Sarah walked back in just as the coordinator left. She saw the look on my face. She didn't ask what happened. She just walked over to the nightstand and picked up David's tablet. "I tried to find him in the parking lot," Sarah said. "But he's long gone. His car isn't in the visitor logs anymore, but I noticed something when the screen lit up." She handed the tablet to me. It's not locked, Olivia. He didn't even have a passcode, or maybe he thought he was so smart he didn't need one. I took the device. My fingers were cold. I swiped the screen. It opened directly to a web browser. There were 3 tabs open. One was a flight booking site. The second was the login page for our bank. The third was an iMessage thread. The most recent message was from a contact saved only as C as it done. C had asked at 9:20 a.m. Done, David had replied, the transfer cleared, she's in the OR, she won't know for hours. Good, C wrote back. I'm so tired of pretending to care about her recovery. See you at the house. I stared at the C, my sister's name is Chloe. But I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it could be anyone. A colleague named Chris, a cousin named Catherine. Then I scrolled up. 3 days ago, C had sent a photo. It was a picture of a designer wedding dress, the one Chloe had been bragging about for weeks. Mark thinks his parents are paying for this, Chloe had written. He has no idea we're using Olivia's little nest egg to fund the upgrade. It's only fair, David. She was never going to use that baby fund anyway. She can barely take care of herself. David's reply was instant. She's a sinkhole for money and time. I'm done being her nurse. Once the surgery starts, we're free. I've got the note ready. I'm leaving it on her clothes so she sees it the second she wakes up. So poetic, Chloe replied. I felt the room tilt. The betrayal wasn't just a husband leaving a wife. It was a sister helping a husband dismantle her own sibling's life to buy a more expensive dress and a fresh start. They had choreographed the timing of my surgery like a military operation. They had waited for me to be literally cut open so they could bleed me dry. I have them, I whispered. You have what? Sarah asked, leaning in. I have the proof, I said. I looked up at her, and for the first time since I woke up, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a witness. They didn't just steal my money, they stole my life. And they're planning to do it to Mark, too. I scrolled further. Chloe was planning to leave Mark after the lavish engagement dinner once she had secured some other financial tie David was working on. They were using us, both of us. Sarah, I said, my voice gaining strength. I need you to help me do something. I need to get these messages off this tablet before he realizes he left it and tries to wipe it remotely. I've got a secure cloud drive, Sarah said, pulling her own phone out. And I know the hospital's IT guy. He can help us verify the timestamps so they can't claim it's fake. I looked at the tablet screen. Chloe's face was in the contact icon, smiling, wearing a flower crown. That was the last time she'd ever smile at me. By the next morning, the betrayal had leaked out of my marriage and into the very air of my family. I was still in the hospital bed, the surgical tape pulling at my skin every time I breathed, when the second wave of damage hit. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the erasure of my reality. I had tried to call my sister one last time. I wanted to see if she would lie to my face. Olivia, please, Chloe said, her voice sounding breathless like she'd been running. I really don't have time for your paranoia. David called me crying. He said you had a breakdown in the recovery room and started screaming about money that isn't even yours. He's staying at a hotel because he doesn't feel safe around you. He took my money, Chloe. He left a note calling me a burden. He said you wrote that note yourself to frame him, she snapped. Mom and Dad believe him. Honestly, Liv, with your health history, maybe you are having a reaction to the meds. We're all just trying to get through the engagement dinner tomorrow. Mark is already suspicious because you're making such a scene from a hospital bed. That was the spillover. They weren't just stealing, they were rewriting my sanity. David had already reached out to our parents and Chloe's fiancé, Mark, painting me as a mentally unstable woman who was hallucinating a financial crisis. I looked at the tablet in my lap. The screen was still open to the messages. She's a sinkhole for money and time, David had written to my sister. We're free, she had replied. I realized then that if I didn't act, I would leave this hospital and find a world where I was the villain. My parents would look at me with pity, David would have my $58,000, and Chloe would walk down the aisle in a dress paid for by my pain. The story was getting bigger. It wasn't a tiff anymore. It was a conspiracy. Around noon, a nurse I didn't know came in to change my dressings. She was brisk and didn't look me in the eye. "I heard there was some trouble with your discharge plan," she said, peeling back the tape. "Social services is sending someone down at 2. They have a shelter bed available, but you'll have to take a bus. We can't provide transport for non-medical discharges." "A bus?" I whispered. "I can barely stand." "Those are the rules," she said. I felt a cold prickle of dread. This was the consequence of David's timing. By draining the account while I was under, he hadn't just taken my future, he'd taken my ability to recover. He was counting on me being too weak to fight back, too broke to hire a lawyer, and too unstable for anyone to believe. I opened the tablet again. I needed to know how deep this went. I found a folder in the gallery. It wasn't just texts. There were photos of bank statements, Mark's bank statements. Chloe had been taking pictures of her fiancé's private financial documents and sending them to David. "Mark has a secondary savings account for the house," one message from Chloe read. "Once we have Olivia's money as a cushion, I'm going to tell him I need a wedding emergency fund and have him transfer his half to me. Then we'll have over 100,000. We can leave the state before the honeymoon even starts." David's response: "I've already looked at rentals in Scottsdale. We can be gone by the 15th. Let her try to find us with no car and no cash." They weren't just having an affair. They were predators. They were using the two people who loved them most as ATMs. Chloe was planning to fleece Mark just as thoroughly as David had fleeced me. The room felt small. The walls seemed to be closing in. I looked at the clock. The engagement dinner, the one my mother told me not to ruin, was in less than 30 hours. That was the public arena. That was where Chloe would stand up and talk about love and family while wearing a dress bought with the money meant for my unborn child. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't wait for a lawyer. I couldn't wait for my parents to grow a conscience. I tapped the share icon on the most damning thread, the one where they discussed the burden note and the Scottsdale rentals. I typed in Mark's email address. I knew it by heart because I'd helped him set up his home office last year. My thumb hovered over the send button. If I did this, there was no going back. I would be blowing up my sister's engagement. I would be destroying the peace my mother cherished so much. I would be admitting that my husband was a thief and my sister was his accomplice. I looked at the burden note on the nightstand. I hit send. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated. It wasn't a text, it was an email notification. "Mark has opened the shared file." I held my breath, waiting for the explosion. I expected a phone call, screaming, or maybe David charging into the room to take the tablet back. But for 20 minutes, there was nothing but the sound of the hospital. Then my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered it, my heart hammering against my stitches. "Olivia." It was Mark. His voice didn't sound angry. It sounded hollow. It sounded like he had just been told the world was ending. "I'm here, Mark," I said. "The photos of my bank statements," he whispered. "She took those while I was in the shower. I recognized the reflection in the screen. Olivia, is this real?" "Check your joint account, Mark," I said. "Check if she's asked for an emergency fund transfer yet." There was a long silence on the other end. I heard the sound of a keyboard clicking, a sharp intake of breath. "She asked this morning," Mark said. "She said she wanted to pay the caterer in full to get a discount. I was going to send it tonight." "Don't," I said, "and don't tell her I called." "I'm coming to the hospital," he said. "Don't sign any discharge papers. I'm coming right now." He hung up. I leaned back against the pillows, exhausted. The trap was set, but I was still the one in the cage. I had no money, a body that was failing me, and a family that wanted me silenced. But I wasn't alone anymore. The burden was starting to shift. Mark arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later. He didn't look like the confident, successful architect I'd known for 3 years. He looked smaller, his expensive wool coat hanging off his shoulders as he navigated the sterile hallway. When he reached my bed, he didn't say a word. He just pulled the guest chair close to the railing and sat down, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook just once, and then he went incredibly still. "I checked the logs," he said, his voice muffled by his palms. "She didn't just ask for the money today. She's been systematically moving small amounts from our wedding vendor deposits back into her personal account for months. I thought the caterer was just being aggressive with the payment schedule. I didn't think my own fiancé was laundering our wedding budget." "She's not just laundering it, Mark," I said, reaching for the tablet. "She's planning a life with David, my husband. They're using our money to buy their way out of our lives." I showed him the screenshots Sarah and I had organized, the messages about the Scottsdale rental, the photo of the designer dress. The one where David told Chloe he had successfully moved the $58,600 and that I was under and wouldn't know until he was already halfway to the airport. Mark stared at the screen. His eyes tracked the words, his face hardening into a mask of cold, sharp realization. "He was supposed to be my best man," Mark whispered. "He stood in my living room last week and toasted to our future. He said I was lucky to have a woman like Chloe." "He was talking about himself," I said. "They both were." Nurse Sarah walked in then, carrying 2 cups of lukewarm cafeteria coffee. She handed one to Mark and one to me. She had been staying past her shift, documenting the tablet's discovery in the hospital's official incident log. "I spoke with the hospital's legal counsel," Sarah said, her voice steady and professional. "Since the tablet was found in a public area and contains evidence of a felony, the unauthorized transfer of funds, they are required to preserve the device. I've already contacted the local police department to file a report on Olivia's behalf. They'll be here in an hour to take a statement." Mark looked up, a flicker of something, clarity maybe, returning to his eyes. "A police report, that makes it official. It's not just a he said, she said family fight anymore." "Exactly," Sarah said. "And because the amount is over 50,000, it's a grand larceny charge in the state. David didn't just leave his wife, he committed a crime. And if Chloe helped him plan it, she's an accessory." The support didn't make the pain go away. My stomach still burned from the surgery, and the thought of my sister plotting my ruin while I was unconscious still made me want to throw up. But having Mark there, and having Sarah treat this like a crime rather than a scandal, changed the air in the room. I wasn't the unstable burden David had described in his note. I was a victim of a coordinated theft. "What are we going to do?" Mark asked. "I can't just go home and look at her. I can't sit across from her at dinner." "Yes, you can," I said. I felt a coldness settling into my own bones. "You're going to go home and you're going to act like you haven't seen a thing. You're going to tell her the money for the caterer will be ready on Friday night, right before the dinner." Mark frowned. "Why wait? I want to throw her clothes on the lawn right now." "Because if you do that now, our parents will protect her," I said. "They'll help them disappear with my money. They'll hide them at some relative's house and tell the world I'm the one who went crazy. We need them in a room where they can't run. We need the whole family to see what they really are." Mark looked at me, then at the burden note still sitting on the table. He picked up the paper, reading David's cruel, jagged handwriting. "He called you a burden," Mark said, "but he's the one who's about to be a weight around her neck. I'm in Olivia, I'll play the part, I'll give the toast she wants. I'll be the perfect fiancé for 48 more hours." "Thank you," I whispered. "Don't thank me," Mark said, his voice flat. "I'm doing this for me, too. I was going to give that woman my life. I need to see the look on her face when she realizes she's lost everything." Sarah checked my vitals one last time. "I'm going to talk to social services," she told me. I'm going to tell them you have a safe place to go. You're not going to a shelter, Olivia. Mark, can she stay with your sister or a friend? She can stay at my guest house, Mark said. It's 10 minutes from the restaurant. I'll pick her up from the hospital tomorrow morning. We'll get her settled, and then we'll get ready for the dinner. For the first time since I woke up from surgery, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. The money was gone, but the truth was starting to weigh more than the theft. I looked at the tablet, sitting there like a black box from a plane crash. It held the records of every lie they'd told, every cent they'd stolen, and every moment they'd mocked my pain. David thought he was leaving a burden behind. He didn't realize he was leaving the one person who knew exactly how to make him carry the weight of his own choices. Get some sleep, Olivia, Mark said, standing up. You're going to need your strength for Friday. I watched him walk out, his back straight again. I looked at Sarah. Is it wrong that I don't feel bad about ruining her night? Sarah smiled, a small, sharp smile. Sweetie, she ruined her own night 6 months ago. You're just the one turning the lights on. I lay back and closed my eyes. The hospital was quiet, but in my head the clock was already ticking toward the engagement dinner. They wanted a celebration. I was going to give them a reckoning. By the time Mark picked me up from the hospital the next morning, the leverage was no longer just a collection of angry texts. It was a weapon. I sat in the passenger seat of his car, my hand pressed against my abdomen to steady the dull ache of my incisions. On my lap sat a manila envelope. Inside was a printed copy of every single message thread from David's tablet, the bank transfer receipt Sarah had helped me download, and a photocopy of the handwritten, burden note. The original tablet was locked in the hospital's security safe, officially logged as evidence. But the digital copies were everywhere. They were in Mark's cloud storage, on a thumb drive in my pocket, and sent to a friend of mine who worked in forensic accounting. He called the house last night, Mark said, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. David did. He asked Chloe if the nuisance was still at the hospital. He didn't even use your name, Olivia. He called you a nuisance. What did Chloe say? I asked. She laughed. She told him you were probably still sedated and drugged up and that the problem was being handled by social services. She told him she couldn't wait for the dinner tonight because she was looking forward to the announcement. I looked out the window at the passing trees. The announcement. They're actually going to do it, aren't they? They're going to use your engagement dinner to announce they're leaving together. That's the plan, Mark said. Chloe told me this morning that she wants to make a special toast to new beginnings. She's even invited a few extra friends of hers. She wants a crowd. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. They weren't just stealing my money. They were planning to use Mark's social circle and my family's presence to validate their brave new love. They wanted to frame their betrayal as a romance, with me as the bitter, unstable obstacle they finally overcame. I called the bank's fraud department this morning, I said. Because David used his own device but my login credentials, which he stole from my password manager while I was prepping for surgery, they've flagged the transfer as high risk. They can't reverse it instantly because the money is already in a secondary holding account he set up, but they've frozen that account. He can't touch a cent of that $58,600. Mark glanced at me. So he's broke. He just doesn't know it yet. He thinks he's rich, I said. He thinks he's sitting on a fortune. He's probably already signed the digital lease for that place in Scottsdale. But when he tries to pay the deposit or the movers, that card is going to decline. That was the first piece of real leverage. David's entire exit strategy was built on money he no longer had access to. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, holding a bag of paper he thought was gold. But the second piece of leverage was the one that would hurt Chloe. Mark pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a thick folder. I did some digging of my own last night. Chloe has been using my company credit card for wedding expenses. I checked the itemized statements. She didn't just buy a dress, Olivia. She bought 2 first-class tickets to Cabo for next week. She bought a set of luggage. She even bought a new watch, a men's Rolex. David's favorite brand, I whispered. I've already called the credit card company, Mark said. I reported the charges as unauthorized. Since we aren't married yet and she isn't a legal signer on that corporate account, she's looking at fraud charges on top of everything else. I'm not playing nice anymore. This changed everything. The leverage was now a physical, legal reality. We weren't just two people who had been cheated on. We were the holders of the evidence that could put them both in orange jumpsuits. I looked at my phone. I had a missed call from my mother. I didn't call her back. I knew what she'd say. She'd tell me to be gracious. She'd tell me that Chloe had worked so hard on the centerpieces. She'd tell me that my negativity was ruining the family's reputation. She had no idea the reputation was already gone. It had died the moment David hit send on that transfer. Are you sure you can do this tonight? Mark asked, looking at my pale face and the way I moved gingerly to get out of the car. You're still healing. I've never felt more awake, Mark, I said. I walked into his guest house and sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at the burden note. I realized that for years I had believed him. I had believed I was the difficult one, the one who took up too much space, the one whose health was a chore. I had carried that weight until I nearly snapped. But tonight I was going to hand it back. I spent the afternoon with Mark, mapping out the dinner. We knew the restaurant, a high-end Italian place with a private room in the back. We knew the guest list, 24 people. My parents, our cousins, Mark's parents, and the friends Chloe had invited to witness her triumph. We decided on the sequence. We wouldn't interrupt. We wouldn't scream. We would let them tell their lies until they were completely out of breath. We would let them climb as high as they wanted before we pulled the ladder. I want them to feel exactly how I felt in that recovery room, I told Mark. I want them to see the truth and realize there is no exit. They won't see it coming, Mark promised. As the sun began to set, I got dressed. I chose a high-necked black dress that covered my bandages and my bruises. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who was about to move the weight. David thought he had left me in a hospital bed, broken and penniless. He was about to find out that a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. The day of the engagement dinner, the air felt thick, like the moments before a massive storm breaks. I spent the morning in Mark's guest house, sitting on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, watching the clock. My physical body was a map of pain, sharp stabs whenever I moved too quickly, but my mind was a cold, quiet machine. I had 3 things to do before we left for the restaurant. First, the logistical move. I called the bank one last time. I needed to be sure. The account is still under administrative hold, Ms. Harris, the representative told me. The secondary account your husband opened, the one he moved the $58,000 into, is currently flagged for suspected fraud. He's tried to access it 3 times today from a mobile device. Each time the transaction was blocked. Can he see why? I asked. No, it just looks like a technical error on his end. He has no idea the funds are actually frozen by the fraud department. That was the first lock on the door. David thought he was a wealthy man ready to start a new life. In reality, he was a man who couldn't even buy a sandwich on his own credit. Second, the emotional move. I finally answered a call from my father. Olivia, he said, and I could hear the disappointment in his breath before he even finished my name. I just spoke to Chloe. She says you're still refusing to come home and that you've been sending threatening messages to Mark. We're all at the restaurant setting up. Your mother is nearly in tears. Do you have any idea how much stress you're putting on this family? I'm coming to the dinner, Dad, I said. My voice was so calm it surprised me. Well, thank God. But listen to me, you are to sit at the back table with your cousins. No talk of the stolen money. No talk of David leaving. We are celebrating Chloe's future tonight. If you cause a scene, I will personally see to it that you're cut off from this family for good. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly," I said. I didn't tell him that the family was already a ghost. I didn't tell him that the daughter he was protecting was the one who had already robbed him of his dignity. I just hung up. That was the moment I let go of the hope that they would ever choose me. They had already made their choice. Tonight was just the bill coming due. Third, the risk move. I had Mark bring me the clothes David had left in the guest room weeks ago. I searched the pockets of his favorite suit jacket, the one he'd planned to wear tonight. Inside, I found exactly what I expected: a printed flight confirmation for 2 people, one way to Scottsdale, leaving tomorrow morning at 6:00 a.m. He hadn't even waited for the surgery recovery period to end. He was going to stand in that restaurant tonight, toast to Chloe's happiness, and then drive her straight to the airport with my life savings in his pocket. "It's time," Mark said, standing in the doorway. He was wearing his tuxedo, looking every bit the perfect groom-to-be, but his eyes were like ice. "Are you ready?" I asked. "I've spent the last 4 hours looking at the photos of my own bank statements on that tablet," Mark said. "I'm beyond ready. I've already moved my personal belongings out of the house I shared with her. As of 5 minutes ago, her key doesn't work on the front door anymore." We drove to the restaurant in silence. The Italian place was called Vittorio's, a spot with heavy velvet curtains and gold leaf mirrors. It was the kind of place my family loved because it looked like old money, even if the people inside were currently bankrupt of any real character. When we pulled up, I saw my parents' car in the valet line. I saw my sister's best friends laughing on the sidewalk, holding gift bags wrapped in silver paper. "They think this is a coronation," Mark whispered as he helped me out of the car. "Let them," I said. I felt the weight of the manila envelope in my bag. I felt the stiffness of the burden note against my side. I walked toward the entrance, every step a reminder of the stitches in my stomach and the betrayal in my heart. As we reached the heavy oak doors of the private dining room, I heard Chloe's laughter. It was loud, bright, and completely unafraid. She was at the center of the room, holding a glass of champagne, leaning her head against David's shoulder while my parents beamed at them both. David looked up and saw me. He didn't look guilty. He looked annoyed. He checked his watch, then leaned in and whispered something into Chloe's ear. She looked over at me and smirked, a tiny, triumphant tilt of her lips. They thought I was the ghost at the feast. They thought I was the problem they had finally solved. I walked into the room and took my seat at the very back, just like my father had ordered. I didn't say a word to anyone. I just watched. I watched the way David touched her arm. I watched the way my mother adjusted Chloe's hair. I watched the way they all ignored the woman who had just had her life stolen 48 hours ago. The waiters began to circle with the first course. The room was full of the smell of garlic and expensive wine. Mark walked to the head of the long table. He picked up a silver spoon and tapped it against his crystal glass. The ringing sound cut through the laughter, silencing the room. "Everyone," Mark said, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "If I could have your attention, I have a few things I'd like to say before we begin the main course." I reached into my bag and gripped the envelope. The countdown was over. The room didn't go quiet because they felt guilty. It went quiet because Mark was the one with the money, and in my family, the person with the money always gets the floor. Mark stood at the head of the table, his glass held high. He looked every bit the proud groom, but I could see the way his fingers were white where they gripped the stem of the crystal. Chloe was beaming, leaning back in her chair with a look of absolute smugness. David was sitting right next to her, his hand resting casually on the back of her chair, a position he never would have taken if he thought I was actually paying attention. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," Mark began. His voice was steady, projecting to the corners of the private room. especially my future in-laws who have always been so, protective of their family's image. My mother smiled and gave a little royal nod. My father leaned back, looking satisfied. And of course, Mark continued, I want to thank Chloe. She's been so busy lately, planning a wedding, planning a future, planning things I didn't even know were on the schedule. Chloe let out a little girlish giggle. Oh, Mark, you're embarrassing me. I don't think that's possible, Chloe, Mark said. The smile stayed on his face, but the tone of his voice shifted. It went from warm to surgical. I actually have a special gift for the happy couple tonight. Because as it turns out, we're not the only ones planning a new life together. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of folded papers. He didn't hand them out, he just held them. I found some interesting reading recently, Mark said. It's a series of messages. They're very poetic, very detailed. They talk about a fresh start in Scottsdale. They talk about using a baby fund to pay for a designer wedding dress. They even talk about how a certain person is a sinkhole for money and time. The air in the room didn't just change, it vanished. David's hand slid off the back of Chloe's chair. He went perfectly still, his eyes darting toward the door. Chloe's smile didn't fade, it curdled. She looked like she'd been slapped but hadn't felt the pain yet. Mark, my mother said, her voice trembling. What is this? This is a celebration, don't be macabre. I'm not being macabre, Diane, Mark said, looking directly at my mother. I'm being thorough. I think everyone should hear how David and Chloe spent the morning of Olivia's surgery. David, do you want to read the texts, or should I? David stood up. His face was the color of sour milk. Mark, man, you're drunk. Let's go outside and talk about this like adults. Sit down, David, my father barked. He was looking at Mark's papers. My father is a man who knows when a bluff is being called, and he could see Mark wasn't bluffing. Mark opened the first page. 9:20 a.m. while Olivia was on the operating table. Chloe writes, Is it done? David responds, Done, the transfer cleared. She's in the OR, she won't know for hours. Chloe responds, Good, I'm so tired of pretending to care about her recovery. A cousin at the middle table gasped. A fork clattered against a plate. That's a lie, Chloe screamed, standing up. Her face was flushed a deep, angry red. He's making it up. He's jealous because I've been spending time helping David with the divorce. Helping him with the divorce, I said. I stood up from the back table. Every eye in the room pivoted to me. I walked slowly toward the front, the pain in my stomach a sharp reminder of why I was there. I reached into my bag and pulled out the original burden note. You mean the divorce he started while I was unconscious? I asked. I walked up to Chloe and dropped the note onto her plate, right on top of her expensive sea bass. Is this the help you gave him? Helping him write a note telling his wife of 5 years that she's a burden while he steals $58,000 from her? Chloe looked at the note. She didn't pick it up. She looked at it like it was a cockroach. Olivia, go sit down, my mother hissed, reaching for my arm. You're making a scene, you're ruining everything. She didn't ruin it, Mom, I said, pulling away. They did. Look at the date on that note. Look at the timestamp on the bank transfer. David moved the money at 9:15. I was under anesthesia. He didn't even wait to see if I'd wake up from the gallbladder complications. He just took the money and went to see his girlfriend, my sister. It wasn't like that, David shouted. He was looking around the room, trying to find an ally. He looked at my father. Sir, you know how she is. She's been sick for a year. She's been draining our finances with these treatments. I was just securing my future. I was going to give her some of it back later. With the money you were using for the Scottsdale rental, Mark asked, dropping a printout of the lease agreement in front of my father. Or the Rolex Chloe bought you on my corporate card. My father picked up the lease agreement. He read it in silence. Then he looked at Chloe. You were going to Scottsdale tomorrow. Chloe started to cry. It was her go-to move. The golden child tears that usually ended every argument. I fell in love, Dad. You can't control who you love. Mark was always so cold, and David understood what I was going through with Olivia's constant drama. My drama, I interrupted. My voice was low, but it carried. My surgery was drama. My 5 years of working 2 jobs while David found himself was drama. The baby fund I built while you were out buying shoes was drama. You never would have had a baby anyway. Chloe shrieked, the mask finally falling off. Her face was distorted with a kind of hatred I'd never seen. You're too broken. David deserved a real woman, not a patient he had to nurse every night. We were going to take that money and actually live instead of watching it sit in a bank account while you complained about your back. The room went deathly silent. Even my mother looked away then. That was the line. My father stood up. He didn't look at me. He looked at David. Get out. Wait, let's talk about the money, David started. Get out, my father roared. And David, don't bother checking your phone, I just called my attorney. If 1 cent of Olivia's money is missing by tomorrow morning, I will spend every dime I have making sure you never see the sun again. The money is frozen, Dad, I said. I already took care of it. He's been trying to spend it all day, but he's broke. He's been broke since 10 o'clock this morning. David's face went from pale to a terrifying, mottled purple. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb tapping furiously. He was checking the account. I watched his eyes go wide as he saw the administrative hold message. He looked at Chloe. The romance was dying in real time. Without the $58,000, they weren't two lovers starting over in Arizona. They were just two thieves with no car, no house, and no one left to lie to. You froze it, Chloe whispered, looking at David. David, you said it was safe. You said we were set. I didn't know, David stammered. Mark stepped forward. He took the engagement ring off the table, the one he'd been planning to put on Chloe's finger during the toast, and tucked it back into his pocket. The caterer isn't paid, Chloe, Mark said quietly. Neither is the venue, and the corporate card you used for that watch. I've already filed the fraud report. The police will probably be at your apartment by the time you get a cab home. If you can afford a cab. Mark looked at me. He didn't smile. He just nodded once. Then he turned and walked out of the room. Chloe tried to run after him. Mark, wait, it was his idea. David manipulated me. I was just confused. But David wasn't having it. My idea? You're the one who told me the passcode to her laptop. You're the one who picked the city. They started arguing right there in front of the gold leaf mirrors, screaming at each other about whose fault it was that they were now caught and penniless. It was pathetic. It was small. These were the people I had spent years trying to please. These were the people who had made me feel like a burden. My mother was sitting in her chair, staring at the white tablecloth. She looked older than I'd ever seen her. I told you not to ruin it, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't ruin it, Mom, I said, leaning down so I was eye level with her. I just stopped helping you pretend it was beautiful. I turned and walked out. I didn't wait for the dessert. I didn't wait for my father to offer me a ride. I walked through the heavy oak doors and into the cool night air. My stitches hurt, and my bank account was still in limbo, and I had no husband and no sister. But as I stood on the sidewalk, I realized something. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel heavy. I wasn't carrying David's secrets. I wasn't carrying Chloe's ego. I wasn't carrying my parents' expectations. I was just carrying myself. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The aftermath didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, steady dismantling of the life I thought I knew. David tried to call me from a burner phone 2 days after the dinner, his voice cracking with a desperation I had never heard before. He told me the Scottsdale lease had been canceled, the movers had sued him for a broken contract, and he was sleeping on a friend's couch because the locks on our house had been changed by the bank during the fraud investigation. Olivia, please, he pleaded. I made a mistake. I was overwhelmed. We can fix the account. I'll give it all back if you just tell the police it was a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding, David, I said. sitting in the sun on Mark's guest house porch. It was a choice. You chose to leave a note calling me a burden while I was in recovery. You can explain that misunderstanding to the district attorney. I hung up and blocked the number. I never spoke to him again. The $58,600 was eventually returned to my sole account after a grueling 3-month investigation. David faced charges for unauthorized electronic transfer of funds, and while he avoided prison through a plea deal, his reputation in our city's legal community was incinerated. He works as a document reviewer now, 3 states away, living in a studio apartment he can barely afford. Chloe's fallout was more public. Mark followed through on the fraud report regarding the corporate card. My parents eventually dipped into their own retirement to pay off her legal fees and the wedding vendors she had defrauded. But the golden child crown was gone. She lives in my parents' basement now. They don't post photos of her on Facebook anymore. The son of our family finally went behind a cloud, and for the first time, the rest of us stopped squinting. I stayed at Mark's guest house for a month while I finished my physical recovery. We aren't together, we are just 2 people who survived the same shipwreck. Sometimes we grab coffee and talk about the lives we're building now, lives that aren't defined by who we're supporting or who we're trying to please. Yesterday, I moved into my own apartment. It's small, but it's quiet. I spent the afternoon organizing my new kitchen. I bought a set of plates that I actually like, not the ones David picked out. I sat at my small wooden table and checked my bank balance. $58,612.42. The $12.42 is still there. I keep it as a reminder of what he thought I was worth and how wrong he was. I'm healthy now. The pain in my stomach is gone, replaced by a strength I didn't know I had. I look at the burden note sometimes, which I've kept in a folder with my medical records. I don't look at it to hurt myself. I look at it to remember that the people who call you a burden are usually just tired of you realizing you're actually a bridge they can no longer walk across for free. If you found a tablet in a waiting room that proved your entire life was a lie, would you have the courage to open it? Or would you rather stay in the dark? Tell me in the comments about a time the golden child in your family finally got caught. I want to hear how you handled the truth when it finally came out. If you want to hear another story about a hospital betrayal that led to a massive family reckoning, click the link in the description. And please, subscribe if you believe the truth always outlasts the lie.